Monday morning, let's talk about week 4. There's a lot happening this week, so I want to go over some of the big ideas and go over your worksheet homework for this week. So we're in week 4. We have 3 major goals this week. Demonstrate understanding of the elements and characteristics of fiction, which you will do in your fiction test. That test opened this morning, Monday morning. It will close Tuesday night. So I keep it short for test security, so that I know you're not cheating. So make sure you have that fiction term sheet and you have memorized all of those terms. Make sure you've read all of the stories, and you'll do just fine. So fiction test due Tuesday by midnight. Analyze 2 works of literature in 2 separate papers. And so we're going to do some work on your first analysis paper over your short story. So that you have a planning sheet due this Wednesday. And then we are starting poetry. So we're wrapping up fiction, starting poetry. If you're like, oh no, not poetry. The good news is, since this is an 8-week class, you only have 2 weeks. Okay, so I hope you find some enjoyment in poetry. I tried to choose poems I think you will get something out of. So let's talk about a little bit of that. Okay, the fiction test, there are 2 parts. The first part to the test is going over the terms and stories. So make sure, look through the tables, make sure you have read every story. All the discussion boards are open, so you can go back through the discussion boards and review the comments just to help you review the stories and the terms that we've discussed. So that's a way to review for that, okay? So you'll have those questions over test 1 or part 1. It is multiple choice. Okay, so I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just making sure that you read them. You've learned these terms that we've been using for the last 3 weeks. That's all we're doing, okay? Don't use your notes or your book for that section of the test, please. And, I just have to trust that you're going to be honest. Part 2 is the essay part. So this is applying some of that learning in a longer format. You may use your book for that section because I want you to use specific quotes. So give me a quote and a page number, okay? So give me strong examples. By the way, these are essays, so you need to write it as an essay, all right? That means introduction, body paragraphs, conclusion. The first section has 25 multiple choice questions, and you have 50 minutes. By the way, once you enter, you cannot exit. So keep that in mind, because I don't want you to think you can start and stop, because you can't, okay? The second part, you have 1 hour to take this test to do the 2 essays. And again, you can use your book for that one. Also, you still have to complete it in 1 sitting. So make sure that you plan accordingly. That's about an hour and a half. The first one is 50 minutes. This one's an hour. You probably won't use all of the time, especially for the first one. So make sure you plan at least an hour and a half. Okay. And that should give you plenty of time to get all this done. Okay. So then there's a lecture on poetry and word choice. So that's what we're going to talk about this week, as soon as it opens. Come on. All right, so here's some things to know about types of poetry, word choice, things like that. So some big ideas for this week: how to paraphrase, different types of poetry, what is a persona, voice, and irony, which we talked about in fiction, but you also get irony in poetry. Okay, so the first thing is to paraphrase. I'm going to ask you in the discussion boards for whatever poem you choose that you first paraphrase it. And what that means is you're going to take each line, if it's a short poem, each stanza, kind of like a paragraph in a poem, and put it in your own words. Okay, and then what ideas emerge, what kind of learning do you have because you've tried to put it in your own words. All right, so other things you're looking for: what words repeat, what themes or what symbols do you see, and then how would this be different if it was written as prose, which is, fiction standard writing, versus poetry. So there's some things to think about as you're reading through and paraphrasing is, okay, what do I see in this? What do I see as far as the sound? Because remember, poetry is about making sound. So you should read these almost out loud. Really, you should, because poetry relies on sound in a way that prose never did. And that's part of the joy of poetry. So can you hear what it sounds like? Because some of the meaning is in the sound of it. So read it out loud. See what you hear. That's a great way to work on analyzing a poem. What themes or what symbols, which just like we talked about with fiction, themes are complete sentences, symbols, things that represent something else. And then, how would this poem be different if it was instead written like a story? And so those are some things to discuss when you're discussing your poems, okay? But the big thing I'll ask you to do is paraphrase your poem for your discussion board. Again, line by line, if it's a shorter poem, stanza by stanza. If it's a longer poem, a lot of the long poems like ballad, ode, and elegy do a lot of repeating. And so if it's just repeating, you don't have to then paraphrase the same thing over and over again. Just paraphrase it once, okay, if it repeats later. So there's a couple different types that we're going to talk about this week's. We're going to focus on these types of poems. And so lyric is a short poem that expresses the thoughts and feelings of a single speaker. It's typically short in length. It has one idea it's trying to get across. Okay. Lyric usually sounds lyrical, and so that's why we call it lyric. Narrative tells a story through a series of events. Ballads and epics are two types of these, and ballad is one of the types to read for this week. Dramatic is when the character speaks directly to us, the reader. Typically, this is written for the stage, so dramatic poetry usually then is a play. So Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare writes all of his plays in poetry form, but it's dramatic because the characters actually speak to us as an audience. But you also see that in regular poetry as well. And then finally, didactic poetry is poetry that's supposed to teach us some kind of lesson, okay? All right, so persona, we've been talking about the narrator or the in fiction, but we don't use that same term in poetry. In poetry, we call it the persona. That is, who is telling us the story. And by the way, a lot of times in poetry, the person telling us the story, the persona, is not necessarily the author. Sometimes the difference between how the persona presents himself and the way you can tell the author feels about the speaker is what creates irony. Okay, it also helps us hear tone and voice, things like that, especially satiric poetry. A lot of times, we see the character differently than the character sees himself, or we see the persona differently than the persona sees him or herself, okay? Don't forget that irony is the difference between what the speaker, the persona, says and what we as the reader know to be true. So it shows us this separation between the author and the character, the persona we're following. So when we see that the persona presents something in one way, but as the reader, the author gives us a different perspective, that creates that irony. So it's that difference between what the persona says and what we know to be true. Okay, so that's where you'll see irony in poetry, but be on the lookout for it because some of them that I chose this week are really great because they're ironic. So I hope you enjoy some of those. All right, the next thing I want to talk about, so there's a little bit about poetry that we're going to talk about. The other thing for this week is your short story analysis planning sheet. Okay, so you click on this, and then I want you to fill it out, and then you'll submit it right here also. Okay, so you'll open it up. By the way, I need you to submit this as a doc, docx, or .rtf. So please don't send it to me as a Google Doc. I cannot open that. Okay, don't send it to me from your Mac. I cannot open those. Please don't send it to me as a PDF. I can't edit on those. So you need to send it to me as a Word document. Okay. All right. So here's what you need to fill out. Make sure you put your name, even though it'll show me. Give me the title of the short story that you're going to be analyzing and the author of that short story. Okay. Then you have 3 choices here. And notice it says choose only one. So you're only going to go one direction with your paper. Do not fill out all 3 sections. Keep this simple. So are you going to tell me about a theme? Are you going to tell me about a literary device? So that would be a specific character, a setting, something like that. One of these literary devices that we've covered. Irony could also fall under literary device. Foreshadowing, something like that. Literary theory are the theories that we talked about in week 1. So maybe you want to talk about feminism or psychoanalytical or something like that. Only fill out one of these 3 sections and then answer the questions that fall underneath. So under question 1 about theme, then you need to fill out these. If you're going to tell me about a literary device, fill out the question here. If you're going to do a theory, fill out these questions. One thing I want to say about theme, be very, very careful then that you don't just write me a summary. Remember, analysis and summary are different papers. That's not what you're doing here. Okay. Then I want you to write me a thesis. A couple things you need to know about a thesis. 1, it should have the author, it should have the title, and what you're going to prove. Okay, so what are you going to prove about theme? Or what are you going to prove about this device? Maybe this particular symbol or something. What are you proving about this particular theory? So make sure you have all 3 parts in there. Then I want you to give me 3 lines or 3 quotes from the story that support the point you're going to be making to show me that you can actually find this idea in the story. You need to include quotation marks and give me the page numbers where you found these. One last thing, make sure it's not a story we have read together. You cannot do those because we've already kind of analyzed those as a class. So it needs to be something else. It can be from your textbook. Maybe if you really loved O. Henry, just Google O. Henry stories and find something else by him. Any of the authors that you've enjoyed, maybe find another story by that author. And that's fine, but you can't do the exact same stories that we've done. Okay. So I want you to fill this out. This is due by Wednesday, so you'll do it, you'll save it, and then you'll go in here and submit it. Okay. Make sure you get that done by Wednesday at midnight. I will try to get those graded on Thursday or Friday and get them back to you so that you have plenty of time to work on them. Okay. The other thing is the discussion board. This week in the discussion board, I will openly admit that there are a lot of poems this week. You can see there's the list. Okay, it's a lot. However, a lot of them are really short. So this shouldn't be all that hard. Even though it looks like a lot of them are pretty short. There are a couple that are longer. They won't kill you, I promise. So get through them. But the discussion board, you will pick one of these to paraphrase, to apply, the ideas of word choice too. Okay, so we're just going to practice this week. Anyway, so that's what you need to know. Oh, actually, I was looking at the wrong week. You're welcome. Week 4 is actually pretty short. But be looking ahead to week 5 because that is the long one. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong list. Okay. But make sure that you take the fiction test. You get your analysis sheet done by Wednesday. You respond in the discussion board. Okay. And look over the Prezi and get your get all of the poems read. Okay. Next week on Wednesday, the paper is due. So that's why I'm going to try to get your worksheet back to you really quickly because the short story analysis paper will be due next Wednesday. So in week 5. Okay. And so I just want you to keep that in mind that that's coming up and plan accordingly because I want you to be able to get through this successfully. So make sure you're watching your dates and getting everything taken care of. Okay. If you have any questions about any of these, I know there's a lot going on this week. That's why I knew I did that. That's why I tried to keep the poems short, the poems list shorter this week because you do have that test and you have your planning sheet due Wednesday and you need to start on your paper. But anyway, make sure you're looking ahead, planning accordingly. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. All right. You guys have a great week. And I will see you in the discussion board. Bye.